The first thing you have to understand about a medieval battlefield is the noise. It was a roar of metal, wood, and flesh. Men shouted. Horses screamed. Arrows hissed through the air like angry snakes. The thud of an axe into a wooden shield was a sound you felt in your teeth. And when a sword or a mace found a home, the sound was wet and final. This was the world where first aid began. It wasn't clean, it wasn't organized, it was desperate. Imagine you're a soldier, maybe an archer or a man at arms. The battle is a confusing mess of bodies and banners. You're trying to stay alive. Then it happens. A sharp, burning pain in your leg. You look down and see the feathered end of an arrow sticking out of your thigh. Your first thought isn't about a doctor. Your first thought is to not die right now. The man next to you might be your only help. He's your friend, maybe your brother. He's not a surgeon, he's a farmer who knows how to use a spear. He might try to pull the arrow out. That was the first, most basic instinct, but it was often the wrong one. Medieval arrows were designed to stay in. The heads, called bodkins or broadheads, had barbs. They were like fish hooks. Pulling it straight out would tear muscle and flesh, making a small wound a gaping one. A smart friend might try to snap the shaft and leave the head in for later. A panicked one would just yank, and you'd likely bleed to death in the mud. Bleeding was the immediate killer. A deep cut from a sword could sever an artery. You had minutes, maybe less. There was no paramedic to call. There was just the ground, your blood, and the ongoing fight. A soldier might press his hand against the wound, or he might grab a piece of cloth from his tunic and try to tie it tight above the injury. This was a basic tourniquet. It was a simple act of desperation. It wasn't based on medical theory. It was based on the simple, observable fact that pressure stops bleeding. Sometimes it worked. Other wounds were different. A blow from a mace or a warhammer didn't cut. It crushed. It broke bones, it turned organs into pulp under your armor. There was no real first aid for that. If you took a direct hit to the head from a mace, you were done. If it broke your arm or leg, you were a liability. You couldn't fight. You could barely walk. Your comrades might try to drag you to the back, away from the main fighting. Or they might have to leave you. It was a hard choice, but survival came first. The most common injuries were cuts and punctures. Swords, daggers, spears, arrows, these were the tools of the trade. First aid was about dealing with these holes in the body. The first person to help you was almost never a professional. It was another soldier. He was scared, he was covered in his own sweat, and maybe someone else's blood. He would use what he had. A strip of linen, his own hands, maybe a canteen of water to wash away the dirt. They didn't know about germs. They had no concept of microscopic bacteria. But they did understand that clean wounds seemed to heal better than dirty ones. They saw it with their own eyes. A wound full of mud and bits of cloth was more likely to fester. So washing a wound was a practical step. They might use water, or if they had it, wine or ale. They thought wine helped balance the body's humors. They were wrong about the reason, but right about the result. The alcohol in the wine was a mild antiseptic. It killed some of the germs. It was a lucky accident. So, in those first few minutes, battlefield first aid was just that first. It was immediate, crude, and improvised. It was done by amateurs in the middle of chaos. The goal was simple: stop the bleeding. Get the person out of the way of the fighting, and hope that they would survive long enough to see someone who actually knew a little more about what to do next. For many, that hope was all they had. The field was littered with men who didn't get that chance. Their first aid was a final prayer from a friend before he had to move on. If you survived the initial injury and the panicked help from a friend, your next hope was to find someone with more skill. These people weren't a single group. They were a mix of characters with different levels of training and knowledge. The idea of a single, trained medic didn't exist. Instead, you had a hierarchy of healers, from the man who cut your hair to the scholar who read Latin. The most common and most useful person on or near a battlefield was the barber surgeon. This sounds like a strange combination to us, but in the medieval world, it made sense. Those barbers had sharp tools. They were skilled with razors and knives. They were used to working on people's bodies. So their job expanded. They didn't just give shaves and haircuts. They pulled teeth, they let blood, and they performed simple surgeries. They were the tradesmen of medicine. A barber surgeon learned his craft through apprenticeship, not at a university. He was a hands-on guy. He learned by watching and doing. He might not be able to read or write, but he knew how to stitch a wound. He knew how to set a broken bone. He knew how to amputate a limb. His knowledge was entirely practical. On the battlefield, this was exactly what you needed. You didn't need a lecture on the four humors. You needed someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands bloody. Armies often employed barber surgeons to travel with them. They were part of the camp. After a battle, they would be overwhelmed with work. They set up tents where the wounded were brought. Their tools were simple saws, knives, probes, and needles. They worked quickly, moving from one screaming man to the next. Their success rate wasn't great by our standards, but they saved lives. They were the true battlefield doctors of the age. Higher up the medical ladder was the physician. A physician was a university-educated man. He could read Latin and Greek. He had studied the ancient medical texts of Galen and Hippocrates. His entire approach to medicine was theoretical. He believed the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness, he thought, was caused by an imbalance of these humors. A physician rarely touched a patient. He would observe, he would examine the patient's urine, he would ask questions. Then he would make a diagnosis based on his understanding of the humors. His treatments were designed to restore balance. He might prescribe a special diet or a series of herbal remedies, or he might recommend bloodletting to remove an excess of blood humor. Physicians were expensive. They served kings and wealthy nobles. You would almost never find one on the battlefield itself, wading through the mud. A high-ranking lord might have his personal physician nearby, in a safe tent far from the fighting. But the common soldier would never see one, and in a way this was a good thing. A physician's theoretical knowledge was mostly wrong. His treatments were often useless for a man with a spear wound. The practical, if brutal, skills of the barber surgeon were far more valuable in that moment. Then there were the religious figures. Monks and nuns played a huge role in medieval healthcare. Many monasteries had an infirmary, a special building for caring for the sick and injured. They also had gardens where they grew medicinal herbs. Over centuries, they built up a vast knowledge of herbal remedies. They knew which plants could soothe pain, which could reduce swelling, and which could help stop bleeding. After a battle, the wounded who could be moved were often taken to the nearest monastery. There, they received care that was often more gentle than what a barber surgeon offered. The monks and nuns would clean their wounds with wine and boiled water. They would apply poultices made of herbs like comfrey, which was known as nipone, for its supposed ability to help heal fractures. They offered food, a clean bed, and prayers. This care was spiritual as well as physical. For a dying man, the presence of a priest or monk could be the greatest comfort of all. The Knights Hospitaller was a military order founded specifically to care for the sick and wounded, running hospitals for pilgrims and crusaders. They combined the roles of soldier and healer. Finally, there were the folk healers. These were often women in local villages, sometimes called wise women. They didn't have formal training. Their knowledge was passed down through generations. They knew the local plants. They knew traditional remedies for common ailments. A soldier might be taken in by a local family and cared for by such a woman. She would use cobwebs to help blood clot, or pack a wound with moss, which had antiseptic properties. Her methods were based on trial and error over centuries. Some were superstition, but many were surprisingly effective. So, the medical care a wounded soldier received depended heavily on who he was and where he was. It was a patchwork of different people with different skills. From the brutal efficiency of the barber surgeon to the quiet care of a monk, they all played a part. There was no system, only a collection of individuals doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. So, what did these healers actually do? What were the specific treatments for a man pulled from the battlefield? The toolkit was small and the methods were often brutal, but they were rooted in experience and a desire to save a life. The focus was on a few key problems: getting foreign objects out, stopping the bleeding, and closing the wound. Removing an arrow was a specialist task. As we've seen, just pulling it out was a bad idea because of the barbed head. A surgeon had a few options. One method was to push the arrow all the way through until the head came out the other side. Then he could snip off the arrowhead and pull the smooth wooden shaft back out the way it came. This created a second wound, but it was often cleaner than trying to drag the barbs back through the flesh. If pushing it through wasn't possible, the surgeon had to cut. He would use a small, sharp knife to widen the wound around the arrowhead. He would carefully work the blade around the barbs, trying to free them from the muscle. He might use a special tool, a type of long, thin forceps called an arrow extractor, to grip the head and carefully maneuver it out. This was delicate, painful work. There was no effective anesthetic. The soldier would be held down by several strong men. He might be given a leather strap to bite on. His only pain relief was a large amount of alcohol in the hope of unconsciousness. Once the arrow was out, or, if the wound was a simple cut from a sword, the next step was to stop the bleeding. If a tourniquet hadn't been applied already, the surgeon would do so. But this was only a temporary measure. The real goal was to seal the bleeding vessels. The most dramatic and common method for this was cauterization. Cauterization meant applying extreme heat to the wound. The surgeon would have a poker or a specially shaped piece of iron heating in a fire. When it was red hot, he would press it firmly into the wound. The sound and smell were horrific. The heat seared the flesh, burning the blood vessels shut. It was an agonizing procedure, but it was effective at stopping catastrophic bleeding. It also had an unintended side effect. The intense heat killed bacteria on the surface of the wound, sterilizing it to some degree. The surgeons didn't know this, of course. They just knew that men who were cauterized were less likely to bleed to death. Not all surgeons liked cauterization. Some preferred to use styptics. These were substances that helped the blood to clot. They would pack the wound with materials they believed had drying properties. This could include flour, egg whites, rabbit fur, or even cobwebs. They also used astringent herbs like yarrow, which was known for centuries as soldiers' woundwort for this very reason. These methods were less reliable for major wounds, but much less traumatic for the patient. After the bleeding was under control, the wound had to be cleaned. This was a critical step. Surgeons used wine, vinegar, or sometimes even the patient's own urine. They would pour it into the wound to flush out dirt, splinters of wood, or pieces of cloth. Again, they didn't know about germs, but they knew from experience that a clean wound was a better wound. Wine and vinegar, being acidic and containing alcohol, acted as mild antiseptics, killing some of the bacteria that could lead to infection. Once cleaned, the wound needed to be closed. For smaller cuts, this wasn't always necessary. But for large, gaping wounds, the surgeon would stitch them shut. He used a curved needle, often made of bronze or iron, and thread made from silk, linen, or animal gut. He would pull the edges of the skin together and sew them with simple, strong stitches. Then he would cover the wound with a dressing. This was usually a piece of clean linen cloth soaked in a healing salve. These salves were often made from honey, which is a natural antibacterial agent, or from herbs mixed with fat or wax. For broken bones, the treatment was remarkably similar to what we do today, just cruder. The surgeon would have to set the bone. This meant manipulating the limb to get the two broken ends of the bone to line up correctly. This was done by pulling and twisting. It was excruciatingly painful. Once the bone was set, he would immobilize it with a splint. The splints were made of wood, leather, or even bark, padded with moss or cloth, and tied tightly with linen strips. The patient would then just have to wait for weeks or months, hoping the bone would knit back together properly. Pain management through all of this was minimal. Alcohol was the main tool. A soldier would be made to drink as much strong wine or ale as he could stomach. Some healers used herbal remedies. The opium poppy, which produces opium, was known for its powerful pain-killing effects. Mandrake root and henbane were also used as sedatives, but these were dangerous. The line between a dose that would render a patient unconscious and one that would kill them was very thin. Most soldiers simply had to endure the pain, with only a scream and a piece of leather for comfort. It was a brutal, hands-on, and agonizing process. The surgeon's work was only the beginning. Surviving the initial treatment was one thing, surviving the days and weeks that followed was another battle entirely. This was the period of recovery, and the greatest enemy was not pain, but infection. In a world without antibiotics, any deep wound was a potential death sentence. After being treated, the wounded soldier was taken somewhere to recover. This could be a tent in the army camp, a nearby monastery, or a room in a local village. The quality of this care varied wildly. A clean bed in a quiet monastery infirmary offered a much better chance than a dirty straw pallet in a crowded, noisy camp. The most fortunate were the knights and nobles, who could afford private care and a better environment. The common soldier took what he could get. The first few days were critical. The surgeon or healer would change the dressings regularly. They would wash the wound again with wine or a herbal infusion. They would look for signs of healing. But often, they saw the opposite. The wound would become red and swollen. It would feel hot to the touch. The soldier would develop a fever, and then came the pus. To us, pus is a clear sign of infection. It's a sign that the body's immune system is fighting a losing battle against bacteria. But for many medieval physicians, particularly in the later Middle Ages, pus was seen as a good thing. They called it laudable pus. They believed it was the body expelling the bad humors from the wound. They thought a wound had to be corrupt before it could heal. This was a terrible and deadly misunderstanding. Based on this theory, some surgeons would deliberately irritate a wound to encourage pus to form. They would stuff it with dirty linen or other irritants. This practice, born from a flawed medical theory, killed countless men. It was a step backward from the earlier, cleaner methods of simply washing a wound with wine and letting it heal. If the infection took hold, it could lead to gangrene. The tissue around the wound would begin to die. The skin would turn black. A foul smell would fill the air. At this point, there was only one option left, a final, desperate measure amputation. Amputation was the stuff of nightmares. It was performed by the barber surgeon. The patient was given a lot of alcohol and held down by several assistants. The surgeon would use a leather strap as a tourniquet to reduce blood loss. Then, using a sharp knife, he would cut through the skin, fat, and muscle down to the bone. He would pull the flesh back to expose the bone. And then he would take his saw and begin to cut. The sound of a saw grating through bone is a sound a man would never forget if he survived. The surgeon had to work fast. Speed was the only mercy he could offer. Once the limb was off, the surgeon had to stop the bleeding from the stump. He would take his red-hot cauterizing iron and press it against the open wound, sealing the blood vessels. Or he might dip the entire stump into a bucket of boiling oil or tar. The shock and the pain were unimaginable. Many men died right there on the table. Those who survived the procedure still had a high risk of dying from infection in the days that followed. But for a man with raging gangrene, this terrifying ordeal was his only chance to live. Even if a soldier avoided a major infection, his recovery was long and difficult. A deep muscle wound would leave him weak. A broken bone that healed badly could leave him with a permanent limp. He might suffer from chronic pain for the rest of his life. Scars were a given. A man's body became a map of the battles he had fought. The mental toll was also immense. We don't have many personal accounts from common soldiers, but we can imagine the fear, the pain, and the trauma they endured. They saw their friends die. They suffered terrible injuries. They lived with the constant threat of death, both on the field and in the sickbed. There was no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. A man was just expected to be tough and get on with it. But the nightmares must have been frequent. For those who did recover, life was never the same. A farmer who lost an arm could no longer work his fields effectively. An archer with a damaged hand was useless in the next battle. Disability often led to a life of begging and poverty. The army didn't have a pension plan or a veterans hospital. Once you were no longer fit to fight, you were on your own. So while the surgeons and healers worked to save a man's life, they could not always save his livelihood. The aftermath of the battle was a quiet, personal struggle that continued long after the noise of the fighting had faded. Looking back at medieval battlefield medicine, it's easy to be horrified. It seems like a world of butchery and superstition. And in many ways it was. Their understanding of the human body was fundamentally wrong. But it's not the whole story. They were not ignorant people doing random things. They were working within a system of knowledge, and they were trying to solve real problems. It's worth taking a moment to see what they got wrong, what they got right, and why it matters. The biggest thing they got wrong was the theory behind it all. The idea of the four humors, which dominated academic medicine for over 1,000 years, was a complete dead end. It led physicians to believe that illness was an internal imbalance. This meant that a sword wound wasn't just a hole in the body, it was an event that threw the body's humors out of whack. Treatments, like bloodletting, were based on this faulty logic. A man who had already lost a lot of blood on the battlefield might have even more blood drained from him by a physician trying to balance his humors. It was a fatal prescription based on a flawed idea. The concept of laudable pus was another catastrophic error. The belief that a wound needed to fester to heal was the opposite of the truth. It encouraged practices that directly introduced infection. This shows the danger of a powerful theory overriding practical observation. An old soldier or a wise woman might know from experience that clean wounds heal best, but the university-trained physician with his Latin texts knew better. In this case, the educated were more dangerous than the uneducated. And of course, their single greatest blind spot was the lack of germ theory. Without understanding that invisible organisms cause infection, they could never develop truly effective antiseptic or sterile practices. They might use a clean cloth, but the surgeon's hands and his tools were not sterilized. Infection was not a risk. It was a near certainty. But despite these huge failings, they did get some things right, often for the wrong reasons. The use of wine and vinegar to clean wounds is a perfect example. They thought it helped with the humors. We know it worked because alcohol and acid kill germs. They reached the right conclusion by accident. Cauterization was a brutal but effective way to stop bleeding. It also sterilized the wound surface with heat. Again, a useful outcome from a desperate action. They understood the basics of mechanics. They knew how to set bones and hold them in place with splints. They knew how to sew a wound shut. The practical skills of the barber surgeons, developed through trial and error over countless battles, were genuinely life-saving. An experienced surgeon who knew how to quickly remove an arrowhead, tie off a bleeding vessel, and stitch a wound cleanly gave a soldier a fighting chance. They also had a deep knowledge of herbal medicine. While some of their herbal remedies were just superstition, many were effective. Willow bark contains a substance similar to aspirin and was used for pain and fever. The opium poppy is a powerful painkiller. Honey, used in many salves, is a natural antibacterial. Comfrey contains allantoin, a substance that promotes cell growth. This was not magic. It was a form of early pharmacology learned through generations of observation. So, what can we take from this? Medieval first aid wasn't a single thing. It was a conflict between theory and practice. The theories of the academic physicians were mostly wrong and often harmful. The practices of the hands-on barber surgeons, monks, and folk healers were a mix of good sense, brutal necessity, and lucky guesses. They were doing the best they could in an age of limited knowledge. They were faced with horrific injuries and had only simple tools to fix them. It's a reminder that medicine is a process of discovery. We stand on the shoulders of people like Ambroise Parr, a 16th century French surgeon who ran out of boiling oil for cauterization and started tying off arteries with thread instead. He found it worked better. He challenged the old ways. That's how progress happens. The medieval surgeon holding a hot iron over a screaming soldier wasn't a monster. He was at the edge of his world's knowledge, fighting a desperate war against death. And sometimes, against all odds, he won.